In our last lecture, we looked at the political, social, and cultural life of Judea during the 1st century CE, when the events described in the Gospels took place. Let's now turn to the wider Roman world and see what it has to tell us about the setting of the rest of the New Testament, the book of Acts, the letters of Paul, and the book of Revelation. As we've already pointed out, the eastern half of the Roman Empire was very different from the west, and it remained so. Much of it had been a Greek-speaking region since the time of Alexander, and its culture was Hellenistic, a fusion of Greek and non-Greek elements. Even after the fall of the Roman West and the rise of Europe, hundreds of years later, the East retained many of these characteristics in the form of the Byzantine Empire, which spoke Greek rather than Latin and was Orthodox rather than Catholic. By the time the New Testament was being written, there were Jewish communities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But older than any of these was the Babylonian community, which had begun with the exile of the kingdom of Judah in the 6th century BCE. By the 1st century CE, Mesopotamia was under the control of an Iranian people called the Parthians, whose territory became the eastern boundary of the Roman Empire and was at odds with it for the next several hundred years. This divided the Jewish world of the period into two parts, and both Babylonia and the land of Israel, which remained part of the Roman world, became centers of Jewish culture and scholarship. Further to the west, there were Jews living in Asia Minor, i.e. present-day Turkey, in Egypt and the rest of North Africa, and in the city of Rome. Judging by the grave markers of Roman Jews, they continued to speak Greek even though they were now living in a Latin-speaking region. It was in these communities that the first churches outside of Judea were founded, both because many of their first members were Jews and because cities like Antioch and Alexandria were major population centers that drew people from across the Mediterranean. In our last lecture, we discussed the fact that in the province of Judea, as in other provinces, the Roman authorities took control over criminal law and over cases of what was considered public unrest. But things were somewhat different for Jews living elsewhere in the Roman world, where outside of Italy itself, they were only one of many ethnic groups who did not have Roman citizenship. As in the case of Judea, it seems that Jews elsewhere in the empire were allowed to practice their religious traditions and live according to their own laws as long as they were not considered a threat to public order. In the book of Acts, a group of Jews in the Greek city of Corinth come to Gallio, the Roman governor, to complain about Paul, whom they accuse of persuading people to worship God in ways contrary to their laws. If they had claimed instead that Paul was causing a disturbance, Gallio's reaction might have been different. But as it was, he replied as follows: "If it were a matter of crime or serious villainy, I would be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I do not wish to be a judge of these matters." In fact, after Paul angers the Greek owners of the slave, who predicts the future for money by expelling the prophetic spirit within her, the owners complain to the Roman authorities that these apostles are disturbing the city, and they are arrested and beaten. The historian Josephus devotes a section of his Jewish antiquities to various proclamations of Roman and local officials which recognize the rights of diaspora Jews to observe their ancestral practices and to be left unharmed. These proclamations are mainly concerned with the right to observe the Sabbath, not to serve in the army, which may also be connected with the Sabbath, to have their own law courts, and to have a place to hold their worship. And yet we know of a number of incidents that suggest that the Jewish residents of the cities of the Roman Empire were not protected from sudden attacks. A site of frequent conflicts between Greeks and Jews was the city of Alexandria, which had the largest Jewish community in the diaspora. The philosopher Philo, who lived there, tells us about these conflicts and the Roman authorities' attempts to deal with them. In the year 38 CE, he writes, the city's Greek inhabitants were given permission by the Roman governor to place images of the emperor Caligula in the synagogues. This had never been done before, out of respect for the Jewish prohibition on images. And since the Greek East had been accustomed since Hellenistic times to build temples where the current ruler was worshipped as a god, the Jews would have seen this as a form of idolatry. This was followed by a spate of attacks on the city's Jewish population, in which, according to Philo, many people were killed and the community's synagogues were destroyed. This incident has caused scholars to wonder whether the Jews of Alexandria had actually been considered citizens with the same rights as its Gentile population, despite the fact that, according to Josephus, Julius Caesar had specifically granted them that status. There were also incidents in Rome itself, as in 139 BCE, when the Jews were expelled along with some other foreign groups on the suspicion that they were endangering the morals of the citizens. A suspicion of such foreign groups, especially if they seemed secretive, was a constant in the culture of the Roman Republic. Then, in 19 CE, the Emperor Tiberius decided to expel the city's entire Jewish population and to force 4,000 of them into military service. His successor Claudius again expelled the city's Jews, as we know from Acts, where Paul stays with some Jewish friends in Greece, fellow tent makers who had moved there after fleeing Rome. These incidents seem to be at odds with the generally positive light in which the New Testament describes the Roman authorities, especially when we consider that for them there was not yet any meaningful way to distinguish between Jews and Christians. The way these Jews were treated suggests that they were not Roman citizens, and they may have come to Rome as immigrants or as slaves. But there were at the same time some Jews who, like other provincials, had acquired proper Roman citizenship. Unlike in modern states, citizenship in the ancient world tended to depend more on who your parents were than on where you lived or even where you were born. The set of rights enjoyed by native Roman citizens since the early days of the Republic was not automatically granted to all the inhabitants of the empire before the 3rd century CE. Until then, the residents of a particular city would be governed by its own laws, though some of them might possess Roman citizenship if they or their ancestors had been specifically granted it as a reward. The former slaves of Roman citizens and their descendants also received the same rights as other Romans, which may be how Paul's family came to have gotten them. But for the first centuries of the empire, it was only the leading aristocrats and council members of provincial cities who would routinely become Roman citizens. Ever since the early Republic, natural-born Romans had enjoyed such rights as protection from corporal punishments like beating or whipping, which Paul angrily points out when he is abused by the local authorities of the Greek town of Philippi. They could also legally marry, leave their property to their children, and make contracts with other people. Peregrines, on the other hand, were left to do such things according to their own laws, and the laws contained in early rabbinic codes like the Mishnah set out in detail how Jews were supposed to handle their property and their interactions with one another. Perhaps the most famous Roman right mentioned in the New Testament was the citizens' right to appeal to the emperor if they were arrested, which meant that they could not be punished until the emperor had heard and rejected their plea for mercy. The problems sometimes faced by the Jews of the Roman world raise the question of the legal status of Judaism as a religious belief. Though it's often said that Judaism, unlike Christianity, was considered legal, this idea only appears in later Christian writings and was not based on actual Roman law. There is, as we said, a section of the Jewish Antiquities in which Josephus records a series of Roman edicts intended to protect the practices of various diaspora Jewish communities. But even assuming that all of these documents are genuine, Josephus is using them to assert that Jews in general enjoyed a protected status under the empire, which isn't surprising given that he was writing in the wake of a major Jewish rebellion. In any case, by the 1st century BCE, Jews were a visible presence in Rome, and we know that some authors of the time described them in the same unflattering terms used by some writers of the Hellenistic period. The politician and orator Cicero, for example, describes them as very influential and even malevolent, in a speech defending a governor of Asia who had been accused of forbidding its Jewish community from sending to Jerusalem the money it had collected for the temple and instead confiscating it for himself. If the Jews of imperial Rome were at risk of persecution and attack and were not necessarily protected under the law, then what does this say about the members of the early church? After all, we know that until the early 2nd century CE, there weren't necessarily any clear distinctions between the communities we now describe as Christian and Jewish. In Acts, Paul describes himself as a Jew and as a Pharisee, and is accepted as such by other Jews. The only question is whether his teachings are accepted as legitimate. And though we are told in Acts that some of the diaspora Jews who had heard Paul teach were angry with him, it was precisely because they saw him as one of their own. In fact, when some of these Jews encountered him in Jerusalem, they accused him of bringing a Gentile into the temple. And it was only when they realized who he was that they decided to take action against him. We should also bear in mind that even though the book of Acts deals with the years after the crucifixion, it was written around the early 2nd century, after Gentiles had started to join the church, and it emphasizes their conversion first in the land of Israel and then in the diaspora. And after Jesus appears to his disciples at the beginning of the book, he tells them to spread his message not just in Judea, but to the ends of the earth. Acts also justifies this turn to the Gentiles by claiming that Paul only approached them because the Jews had already rejected his message. On the other hand, the Christian inhabitants of the Roman Empire were specifically attacked during the 1st through 3rd century CE, beginning with Nero's decision to blame them for the fire that destroyed much of the city of Rome in 64. The fact that they were more consistently attacked than the Jews were, or at least the Jews of the diaspora, since the empire did fight 2 major wars in Judea during that same period, does suggest that the two groups were seen as qualitatively different from one another. Jews at this time had been a familiar presence for hundreds of years, while Christians were a brand new one. And given how much misinformation was being recorded by contemporary writers about Jewish beliefs and practices, for example, that they worshiped the head of an ass, and that their ancestors were lepers, it shouldn't surprise us that the early church was even more misunderstood. But while the attacks on Jews seem to have been connected with their perceived strangeness rather than anything they might have believed, the early church was sometimes depicted in terms that remind us of modern descriptions of cults. According to Christian writers of the 2nd century, the early church was routinely accused of cannibalism and incest. These charges presumably had something to do with the practice of the Eucharist and with the agape or love feasts, especially given the practice of referring to fellow members as brothers and sisters and including both genders in church rituals. And the fact that early churches were not actual buildings, but meetings held in private homes, as we know from Paul's letters, could well have encouraged the Roman fear of private associations, which we have already mentioned, especially considering that the rites of many of the popular religions of the time were carried out in very public settings. Rome had a long history of occasional persecution, including executions and expulsions of the members of suspect associations like the worshippers of Dionysus and astrologers, the magi of the gospel story. But despite this history of persecution, the Christian literature of the time, starting with the Gospels and the Book of Acts, often describes Roman officials as sympathetic to Christians in the face of Jewish accusations. One of the more important institutions mentioned in the Book of Acts, which was new to the later Second Temple period, was the synagogue. Although we know about the idea of prayer as a form of worship from the biblical and post-biblical books set in the diaspora, where Jews had no access to the temple, there were synagogues not only there but in Judea itself. In fact, an honorary inscription from a synagogue has even been found in Jerusalem. This shouldn't surprise us, as these places played a different role from the temple, which since before the Babylonian exile had been the only place where sacrifices could be brought. The temple was also the place where the Levites played and sang music, and it hosted mass gatherings of the people on festivals like Passover. Synagogues, on the other hand, were centers of prayer and study. As the Jerusalem inscription tells us, Theodotus, son of Athenus, built the synagogue for the reading of the law and for the teaching of the commandments, as well as the guest room, the chambers, and the water fittings as an inn for those in need from abroad. In the book of Acts, Paul and the other apostles visit the synagogues of Asia on Sabbaths in order to teach their ideas, and in the course of doing this, they often quote from the Torah and the prophets, which have always been at the center of the Sabbath service. The synagogue was also a place where, unlike the temple, people who were not Jews by either birth or conversion could participate in the life of the community. Such people, who were sometimes called theoseboumenoi, or God-fearers, differed from Jews in that they were not expected to keep all of the commandments. There's lots of archaeological evidence for the presence of these God-fearers in synagogues, where they were sometimes memorialized for their generosity to the community. And when Paul comes to speak at the synagogue in Antioch in Acts 13, he begins, "Fellow Israelites and others who fear God." In fact, the Gentiles to whom missionaries like Paul preached alongside his fellow Jews would have been among the first non-Jews to embrace Christianity. A moment ago, we mentioned conversion to Judaism, and the main indicator of Jewishness during the later Second Temple period seems to have been circumcision. We know that the Hasmoneans forcibly circumcised some of the non-Jews living within their kingdom, and diaspora Jews were known by their Greek and Roman neighbors for this practice and made fun of for it. Juvenal, the first-century satirical poet, writes as follows about the Jews of Rome in his time. Then there are those that, blessed with a Father who reveres the Sabbath, worship only the clouds in the sky, and who swiftly rid themselves of even their foreskins. It's their custom to ignore the laws of Rome, the Judaic code being that which they study, adhere to, and revere. Nor do they reveal the way to anyone but a fellow believer, leading only the circumcised, when asked, to the fountain. Given the centrality of circumcision to Jewish identity, it makes sense that the debate between Paul and the Jerusalem church in Acts 15 over whether Gentile converts also had to keep Jewish law would center around this specific practice. One of the realities that shapes the narrative of the book of Acts was the difficulty and the danger involved in travel and in the spread of information, which were essentially the same thing, because even if a person's ideas were written down, someone had to carry that written material from one place to another. The book of Acts, whose second half is a chronicle of the apostles' voyages across the Mediterranean, is one of our sources of information about what travel was like in the Roman world. Even in summer, when the sea was calmer, ships tended to keep to the coast in case the currents became too dangerous. But even there, they were in danger of hitting rocks. In fact, one of our sources of artifacts from this period, coins, tools, and artwork, is the remains of wrecked merchant ships. At the end of the book of Acts, Paul is headed for Rome so he can appeal to the emperor, when his ship, trying to avoid a storm at sea, runs aground and is wrecked on the island of Malta. Their mistake, as Paul tells the sailors, was to wait until too late in the autumn to attempt the trip, since the Mediterranean could not be safely traveled during the winter. At the same time, one of the more lasting accomplishments of the Roman Empire was its roads, which helped create an economic and social unity from Spain to Mesopotamia. The roads themselves made traveling with horses and wagons easier. But there was still the danger of being robbed along the way, as we know from the precautions taken by various Jewish communities to collect and transport the money they donated every year for the upkeep of the temple in Jerusalem. The same realities that we find in the book of Acts also shape the content of Paul's letters to Christian communities, which are preserved in the New Testament. Paul was writing to the small private communities which were the churches of the time, and he sometimes mentions their members by name. And because he was addressing in his letters the concerns and the beliefs of Gentile Christians, the only exception, the letter to the Hebrews, is now thought to have been written by someone else. Paul maintained that Gentile converts to Christianity did not need to embrace Jewish practice in order to become part of the covenant with God, which until then had been limited to the Jews. Instead, they needed only to have faith in Christ, along with observing the commandments given to Noah, which all people were supposed to observe. In this way, they would receive salvation, which in Paul's view was an individual gift rather than a national one, which was limited to the Jewish people. And while Jews saw the laws given to them in the Torah as the way to keep their covenant with God, Paul talks about the law much more broadly, as a burden which was impossible for any human being to carry, and which the Gentiles did not have to take on because Christ asked them only to believe in him. Paul also drew in his letters on the Hellenistic thought of his time by describing Jesus as both human and divine. This idea had been widespread in the Greek East, where powerful figures like kings, and later on Roman emperors, were worshipped in their own lifetimes, and both Paul and the Gospels describe Jesus as a member of the royal line of King David. The New Testament ends with the book of Revelation, or Apocalypse in Greek. It was written in the 1st century CE, in the wake of a number of books with similar themes written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The most important of these was the book of Daniel, the only one to be included in the Hebrew Bible, though there were others such as the book of Enoch, Jubilees, and the Apocalypse of Abraham. All of these works were attributed to figures who had lived centuries in the past, so that their descriptions of more recent events could be called prophetic. And because it was believed in the later Second Temple period that the sort of prophecy found in the Old Testament had ceased to happen, which meant that people could no longer legitimately describe themselves as prophets. Though these books set out to describe the end of the world, they also discuss its creation, and they claim to tell us what heaven and its angels are like. Enoch, for example, was chosen as the author of such visions because according to Genesis, he never actually died, but was taken up by God. These apocalyptic works also set out a chronological scheme, such as the Jubilees, which were periods of 50 years, into which they organize all of history leading up to the end of the world. While Revelation does contain some of the elements found in these other books, it also differs from them by being set in the present rather than attributed to some ancient figure. But even so, it makes only veiled references to the events of the time it was written, which is generally believed to have been the reign of Domitian at the end of the 1st century. According to some of our sources, this emperor persecuted both Jews and Christians, whom he may not have distinguished from one another. Most famously, Revelation alludes to the emperor Nero, whom Christians considered the first ruler to persecute them, as the beast with 7 heads, whose number, 666, seems to have been derived from the numerical equivalent of the Hebrew phrase Neron Caesar or Nero Caesar. The fact that Nero plays such an important role even decades after his death is not so surprising when we consider that many people at the time believed he hadn't actually died in the year 68, and for years afterward, several people appeared claiming to be him. In our next lecture, we'll look at how the authors of the New Testament responded to the broad cultural and ideological differences between their own world and that of the Hebrew Bible with which they wanted to associate themselves. Please remember to like and subscribe.